From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. I guess I can say good afternoon. It's a minute or two afternoon. I'm Ralph Ehrenberg, Chief of Geography and Map Division. And it's my pleasure on behalf of the John W. Kluge Center and the Geography and Map Division to welcome you to Chet Van Duzer's discussion of his new book, Sea Monsters on Medieval and Renaissance Maps, recently published by the British Library. The John W. Kluge Center brings together scholars and researchers to study and learn about the library's rich resources through fellowships and public programs such as this one. I encourage those of you who have not done so to sign the Kluge Register and to learn more about future Kluge events and fellowships. Travis Hensley, Program Support Specialist, is here to help you if you have any questions. Travis is in the back. Chet was a Kluge Fellow in 2012, which provided the support for his study of Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina of 1516. This research formed the basis of his book, Seeing the World Anew, the Radical Visions of Martin Waldseemüller's 1507 and 1516 World Maps, which Chet co-authored with John Hessler. And we do have copies in our bookshop, and I strongly recommend you to buy one if you haven't. It's a beautiful work. Chet has written and lectured extensively on medieval and Renaissance maps and cartography. He has published nearly 30 articles in journals such as Imago Mundi, Terrae Incognitae, and Word and Images, and lectured in most of the major research centers and libraries in the United States and Europe. He is also the author of Johann Schoner's Globe of 1515, Transcription and Study, published by the American Philosophical Society in 2010, the first detailed analysis of one of the earliest surviving terrestrial globes that include the New World. I'm also pleased to announce that Chet has recently joined the Geography and Map Division, primarily to process our Waldseemüller archives and to edit the publications of the division's two conferences that were devoted to Martin Waldseemüller and his world maps. I'll now ask Chet to take the podium and tell us about sea monsters in medieval and Renaissance maps. Chet.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And I want to begin by thanking the Kluge Center and the Geography and Maps Division for having me here today. The subject this afternoon is a fun one, the sea monsters on medieval and Renaissance maps. The sea monsters on these maps are one of the most lively and visually engaging elements, and they form an important chapter in the history of the scientific illustration of animals and in the history of art. Further, as we will see, they can provide interesting and important information about the sources that cartographers were using in making their maps. Yet strangely, they have received very little study. In what follows, we will look at images of sea monsters on maps from the 10th until the early 17th century. But we will begin with some preliminary matters, some thoughts on the definition of sea monster, a brief look at a classical, medieval, and Renaissance theory that generated many sea monsters, a review of an ancient story about whales that is illustrated on some of the maps we will see, and a look at the different types of medieval maps. So I'll begin with what is a sea monster. The word monster is notoriously difficult to define, and indeed some of the definitions offered by medieval authors are contradictory. While many authors, both classical and medieval, define a monster as being in some way against nature, for St. Augustine and Isidore of Seville, a monster was a part of God's plan, an adornment of the universe that can also teach about the dangers of sin. The 13th century writer and theologian Thomas of Cantimpré, in his encyclopedia titled On the Nature of Things, singles out rarity and large size as two of the distinguishing characteristics of sea monsters. But I think we would all accept that some creatures that are not very large can be monsters. For the purposes of this talk, a sea monster will be defined as an aquatic creature that was thought astonishing and exotic, regardless of whether it was real or mythical, in classical, medieval, and Renaissance times. I also want to emphasize how the idea of what a monster is has changed over time. Today, when we see a picture of a whale, for example, we see a mighty and intelligent animal that is to be protected, and the same is true of walruses. Yet these creatures were considered monsters in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and we see here a map from 1595 on which a walrus is explicitly identified as a monster. It is interesting to think about how our definitions of what is monstrous might change in the future. A number of the sea monsters that appear on medieval maps are hybrids, such as the aquatic lion that we see here. And the source of many of these creatures was the ancient and medieval theory that every land creature had its equivalent in the sea. This theory, which is mentioned by Pliny the Elder, Isidore of Seville, and Gervase of Tilbury, among others, is illustrated in a number of Roman mosaics, such as this one here. We have the aquatic goat, and here an aquatic eagle, which is quite an unusual combination. And so this theory is illustrated not only in Roman mosaics, but also on a number of the maps we will be seeing. And it was a fertile generator of exactly this type of hybrid sea creature. Again, continuing with preliminary matters, I'll look at a widespread ancient and medieval story about whales, which is a story that sailors mistaking a whale for an island. The story first appears in the Physiologus, which was written in the 3rd century AD. The book consists of brief stories about animals, birds, fantastic creatures, and some stories, some about stones and plants as well, each provided with a moral interpretation. The chapter about the whale says that the whale has the appearance of an island, and sailors fix stakes on the supposed island, tie their ship, and descend upon the island, and light fires to cook food. When the whale feels the burning of the fire, it plunges into the depths of the sea and carries with it the ships and all. The moral is that if one puts one's faith in the devil, one will be carried by him to the depths of hell. Variants of the story are illustrated in medieval bestiaries, as we see in this image. Here the whale is quite fish-like, but in other illustrations of the same scene, we see different conceptions of the whale. So here on the forehead of the whale, we see a plant growing, which was part of what deceived the sailors into thinking it was an island. Here again, we see the plants growing and also the cauldron boiling. Here we have a truer conception of the size of the whale. And I'll point out the whiskers there, which is something that we'll come back to later. And finally, I want to mention that the story of the whale mistaken for an island, in addition to appearing in bestiaries, also appears in the life of St. Brendan, a medieval Irish saint who was said to have gone on an extensive voyage in the Atlantic, visiting various islands, including one that turned out to be a whale. And here's an illustration from a manuscript of that saint. Since we don't see medieval maps or Renaissance maps every day, I'm going to briefly review the 3 principal types of them. The first is Mapi Mundi, or world maps. Then we'll look at briefly at nautical charts, and then manuscripts of Ptolemy's Geography. Mapi Mundi are maps of the world. They tend to be very schematic, and I'm going to show you what a Mappa Mundi is by starting with a more familiar image of the world. And then I'll crop it down to the area depicted on Mapi Mundi, and then rotate it to have the same orientation as a Mappa Mundi, and then set it next to a Mappa Mundi. So we can see here the Mappa Mundi is very schematic, very simplified. You're not going to be able to find your way anywhere using it. But it is helpful in indicating the relative positions, locations of the continents. And we call these maps sometimes TO maps, and that name goes back to the 15th century, as we can see in this manuscript. The O for the circumfluent ocean, and the T for the bodies of water that divide the continents, and I identify those here. Separating Europe and Africa, we have the Mediterranean, of course. The Nile was thought to separate Asia from Africa, and the Tanais River, Asia from Europe. And there are, although most of the Mappa Mundi that exist today are like the simple schematic ones I just showed, there are more elaborate examples such as this one, and then still more elaborate examples like this one. And of course, it's the larger and more elaborate ones that it's only that category that can have sea monsters, because on the small ones there's simply not room. And then I briefly mentioned one other type of Mappa Mundi, which is the zonal map, and it shows the world divided into climatic zones. The equator was thought to be uninhabitably hot. Above and below the equator, there were temperate zones that were inhabitable, and then the polar regions were too cold to be inhabited as well. Looking now at nautical charts, these were practical instruments for navigation, so you could find your way somewhere using a nautical chart. This is the area depicted on a typical nautical chart. We'll see some non-typical nautical charts later, but this is the area on a typical nautical chart, the Mediterranean basin, including the Holy Land in the east and some of the Atlantic, basically. And here is such a nautical chart. It takes a moment to orient oneself, but I've indicated Spain on the left there. The Red Sea is helpfully in red, and that the green branch-like thing in northern Africa is the Atlas Mountains. And we'll zoom in a bit, and this is a heavily decorated nautical chart. So the typical elements of a nautical chart, the sort of framework, are the emphasis on coastal features, so you can see the place names all along the coast, and the system of rum lines, which is the network of lines you see radiating out from that point in the upper left. And the precise function of rum lines is still not entirely clear to us today, but it certainly had something to do with navigation. It would be helpful in setting a course. Again, this example is heavily decorated with images of cities, and it's precisely this type of heavily illustrated luxury nautical chart that might have sea monsters. This one doesn't, but it would be one of this nature. Here we can see again the heavy decoration, the images of cities, and that's the Alps there, the green and red. And then I'll quickly show an undecorated nautical chart. This one's in the Geography and Map division in the Madison building. And it just shows the essential features of a nautical chart, the emphasis on the coast and the network of rum lines. And then looking quickly at the third main type of medieval and Renaissance map, those would be those in manuscripts of Ptolemy's Geography. And it's an entirely different system for representing space than nautical charts. Ptolemy used a grid of latitude and longitude, which today to us seems like the only way to do things, but as we saw from the nautical charts, there were other options. And zooming in on one of the regional maps, this is Spain, we can see the grid of latitude and longitude along the edges of the map, and another important difference is that there's much, much more detail in the interior. On the nautical chart, we had a few images of cities, but you can see each one of those dots is a city. So a much more complete and detailed view of the interior of the lands. And here's Italy, just to have a quick look at that. So again, more detail in the interior. So at last, we get to sea monsters on maps. And I'll begin with a Mappa Mundi we saw before, which is one of the Beatus maps. And most of the Mappa Mundi, as I mentioned, are small and schematic and do not have sea monsters. But there is a group of larger and much more elaborate world maps produced from the 10th to the 13th centuries that do include illustrations of sea creatures and sea monsters. These are the Mappa Mundi illustrating manuscripts of the Commentary on the Apocalypse by Beatus of Liébana. And this is the Girona manuscript of that work. And if we zoom in a little bit in the eastern part of the map, we see here a marine chicken, which is exactly one of the hybrid creatures that I mentioned before. And now moving to the western part of the map, the manuscript's damaged, so it's a little bit difficult to see, but we have a man inside a sea monster. And it's difficult to doubt, really, he's not identified, but it's difficult to doubt that this is Jonah, particularly given his gesture, which is with his hand. It's held by his mouth, which is he's probably praying, calling for help from God. And it's quite unusual, actually, to have Jonah depicted inside the sea monster. Usually, as we see on this pulpit in Ravello, he's depicted either exiting from the sea monster or being swallowed by the sea monster. And we'll just zoom in. Here he is emerging from the sea monster. Here's another image where creature's a bit more whale-like with a spout on its head. And one more image. So here he is inside the sea monster. He is clearly praying for deliverance. So that type of imagery, although it's uncommon, did exist. And we'll now have a look at another Beatus manuscript, the San Andres de Arroyo manuscript. Again, zooming in, we have a siren in the west, and from her gesture, she seems to be, I interpret that as dancing, and thus perhaps by implication singing, which is what sirens did to sailors. They sang to try to lure them to their death. And then looking at the western edge of the map, we have some sort of vague sea dragon on the left. In the middle, a man wrestling with two large sea serpents, which is reliably identified as a personification of ocean. And then on the right, a starfish. And the location of the starfish on this map accords very well with that ascribed to the creature by the medieval encyclopedist Thomas of Cantimpré, who says that the starfish lives in the Western Ocean. The map was made in the 13th century, after 1248, and thus not long after Thomas finished his book. And it seems likely that the starfish in the Western Ocean represents the influence of Thomas, since there was not an earlier source that ascribes that location to the creature. And thus we have here an example of a cartographer making use of the most recent information about sea monsters in the creation of his map. We may not think that the starfish is particularly realistic, but he was doing the best he could. This is the world map in the Manchester manuscript of Beatus's Commentary on the Apocalypse. And unfortunately, it's difficult to get much contrast out of the image because it's black on dark blue. But it has a remarkable group of sea creatures in the southeastern part of the circumfluent ocean, that is, the part most distant from Europe, the most exotic realm of the world as far as Europeans were concerned. We have a large siren grabbing a sea serpent with her hand, while a fish nibbles at her tail, and a long sea serpent with a feline head is eating the fish, which is nibbling on the siren. And these chains of animals biting each other are not uncommon in medieval art, but I know of no similar group in any other Beatus map, or indeed in any other medieval map I've seen. So this group of monsters shows that the artist who made this map was free to innovate, rather than just copying the sea monsters on an earlier map of this group. The map also clearly demonstrates the savagery of the outer ocean and its monsters. Moving on from Beatus maps, this is a Mappa Mundi made in about 1180, and it presents a striking vision of the circular disk of the Earth, divided into climatic zones, cold at the poles, hot at the equator, surrounded by an enormous serpentine monster which is devouring its own tail. And beyond it, in the ocean, there are 4 hybrid sea monsters with human heads and fishy bodies and tails. The monster encircling the world is intended to represent the biblical Leviathan in the outer ocean. On this Mappa Mundi, the sea monsters are not only encircle and thus contain the Earth, but also dominate the image visually. The details of the Earth's climatic zones seem insignificant compared to the presence of these enormous monsters. The Church of St. Martin in Zillis, Switzerland, which dates from the mid-12th century, has a ceiling that consists of 153 painted panels depicting scenes from the Bible and from the life of St. Martin. In each of the 4 corners of the ceiling, there is an angel holding 2 trumpets, clearly inspired by St. John's vision of 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth in Revelation 7:1. Further, the water depicted along the 4 edges of the composition is certainly intended to represent the circumfluent ocean, so that the ceiling, although not a map in the modern sense of the word, is an image of the world as a stage for the playing out of Christian history. And the ocean surrounding the earth in the ceiling at Zillis abounds with sea monsters, including a particularly large number of hybrid creatures. So here we have an aquatic stag being bitten by, well, it's hard to be sure, maybe an aquatic lion. And here we have what's more clearly an aquatic lion eating an aquatic chicken, if you see the large tail there of the chicken. And an aquatic elephant, probably intended to represent a walrus, but it's difficult to be sure. On this ceiling at Zillis, the sea monsters certainly indicate that the edges of the world are full of exotic wonders and dangers, and they may also allude to the diversity and fullness of God's creation. We'll move on now to sea monsters on nautical charts. On the Nautical Chart of 1367 by the Pizzigani brothers, there are two ships in the North Atlantic near the western edge of the map. One of the ships is being attacked by a huge octopus, which is pulling a sailor over the side, while a flying dragon carries away another of the mariners. And a legend explains that while these ships were going to port, dragons and octopuses came and carried away men from the ship and bore them into the sea and left the ships empty. I have not been able to determine the source of the story about the flying dragons, but we can identify the likely source of the octopuses attacking the ships. Thomas of Cantimpré, in his encyclopedia titled On the Nature of Things, says that the arms of the polyp, or octopus, are so strong that they can pull a mariner from a ship into the sea and then eat him. Thus, the Pizzigani brothers took some of their information about sea monsters, directly or indirectly, from a scientific source, the Encyclopedia of Thomas of Cantimpré, which was completed about a century before they made their map. The information about and the images of the sea monsters on the Pizzigani map vividly illustrate the perceived dangers of navigation in the Atlantic. Here we have another nautical chart, the Catalan Atlas, made on Mallorca in 1375. It is one of the most elaborately decorated nautical charts that survives today. There is a beautiful siren in the Indian Ocean, and this distant and exotic ocean is a common venue for sea monsters on maps. And then in the Persian Gulf, there are two naked men in the water gathering what seem to be colored rocks, and two well-toothed sea monsters swim away from them. A legend to the northwest explains that these men are pearl divers and says that they use magic spells to keep the sea monsters away. If they do not say the spells, the sea monsters will eat them. So this represents an unusual case in which humans have some control over and protection from sea monsters. Here we have a nautical chart by Mejía de Viladestes made in 1413. It has a whaling scene in the North Atlantic that is the earliest I know of on any map. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. We can see the British Isles there to the lower right, so the whaling scene is to the northwest of that. Zooming in a little bit more and rotating, we see that the ship has fixed its anchor in the whale, and there are two men in a small boat near the whale, but it's not clear that they're doing anything in connection with the whale. The long legend below the scene falls naturally into two parts, as I indicate in this slide. The first part goes, "The sea is called the ocean sea, and therein are found great fish, which sailors take to be small islands, and take up their quarters on these fish, and the sailors land on these islands and make fires, and cause such heat that the fish feels it and sets itself in motion, and they have no time to get on board and are lost." And then the second part, "And those who know this land on the said fish, and there make thongs of its back, and make fast the head of the ship's anchor, and in this way they flay the skin off of it, whereof they make good ropes for their ships, and of this skin are made good coverings for haystacks." So the first part of the legend recounts the myth of the whale mistaken for an island, while the second part conveys very practical information about the use that can be made of the skin of a whale. This combination of myth and practical information suggests that the cartographer was combining material from different sources, and that he certainly had no first-hand experience with a whale. This is the anonymous so-called Genoese map of 1457, zooming in on the Indian Ocean, which again was a common venue for the depiction of exotic monsters. One of the monsters, the one on the left, is a composite sea hog, a pig with a fish's tail, off the eastern coast of Africa. We also have a siren, and here a fish with a human face and a large red spiky crest on its head. Legend explains that this is a Sera. This monster is said to attack the ships of India, usually breaking them immediately, but its crest can get stuck in the ship's wood, and as a result, the creature, unable to escape, kills itself. In the eastern Indian Ocean, there is an imposing creature with a humanoid head and upper body, but with large horns and ears, and red wing-like membranes joining its outstretched arms to its torso, and a fish-like tail. The legend says that the creature sprang out of the water and attacked some cows pasturing on the shore, and then was captured and mounted and exhibited in Venice and other locations. The ultimate source of this monster is a book by the Italian writer Poggio Bracciolini, written between 1438 and 1452, which describes a very similar monster that attacked some women by the seashore and was killed and exhibited in Ferrara. Here we see an illustration of that monster, which is clearly very similar to that on the map. This is another case in which, although the monster on the map seems like something that the cartographer invented, in fact, he took it from a book that he thought was accurate. The cartographer was depicting what he thought was real, as fantastic as it appears to us. This is the Catalanistense map of about 1460. It's unusual because its anonymous cartographer has used run lines and information from nautical charts, but set them in a circular Mappa Mundi format. On this map, there are 3 sirens in the Indian Ocean. As the text explains, one is half woman, half fish, one is half woman, half bird, and one is half woman, half horse. The half woman, half fish, that siren holds a mirror, symbolically indicating beauty, but also vanity. We zoom in a bit. This map reveals an interesting aspect of the painting of sea monsters on maps. We can see a faint rectangular border around each of the sirens, and it's clear that the first artist who was drawing the wavy lines representing the sea left a blank space in the pattern of waves, which was filled in by a second artist, a sea monster specialist. Moving on now to some Ptolemaic maps. This is a Latin manuscript of Ptolemy's Geography, which was made in Florence in approximately 1455 to 60, and it contains a truly remarkable number and variety of sea monsters. In fact, the richest collection of sea monsters in any one manuscript that I've encountered. The monsters are noteworthy because no sea monsters appear in any other of the 53 surviving manuscripts of Ptolemy's Geography that have maps. And we can see here a siren in the upper right. Here we have 2 sirens of quite different natures in the upper and lower registers, and then towards the left, an aquatic dog. And at the top, an aquatic rabbit. And at the bottom, another aquatic pig, of which we saw an example before. The great number and variety of sea monsters on the maps in this manuscript suggest that they were part of the original contract of commission for the manuscript. That is, the sea monsters were in all likelihood an extra cost option chosen for inclusion by the person who was paying for the creation of the manuscript. So it took time and skill to paint these sea monsters, and it was something that was paid for in all likelihood. This is Piri Reis's map of 1513. Piri Reis was a Turkish ship captain and cartographer who lived from about 1470 to 1555. In a text on the map, he says that he made it by combining information from 20 different maps, including medieval Mappae Mundi, Arabic maps, Portuguese nautical charts, and a map by Christopher Columbus, no less. Here is a detail of the scene with the whale on the map, which is another illustration of the story of the whale mistaken for an island. The legend confirms that in this case, the image illustrates the story of St. Brendan. The legend runs, It is said that in ancient times, a priest by the name of St. Brendan sailed through the seven seas. He is said to have landed on this fish, thought it was dry land, and lit a fire on this fish. When the back of the fish began to burn, it plunged into the sea. The people re-embarked in their boats and fled to the ship. This event is not reported by the Portuguese infidels. It was taken from the ancient Mappa Mundi. So, in fact, this image on Piri Reis's map, on a Turkish map, is the earliest surviving representation of the story of St. Brendan on a map. And although the cartographer says that he used earlier maps as a source, there must have been earlier Western depictions of this scene on maps, but they don't survive. Moving on now to the sea monsters of the Renaissance, the transition from the monsters of the Middle Ages to those of the Renaissance can be seen with remarkable clarity in two important maps on permanent display here at the Library of Congress. This is Martin Waldseemüller's world map of 1507, the first to apply the name America to the New World. It does not include any images of sea monsters, but it does have several texts about sea monsters in the Indian Ocean. These texts come from medieval sources and quite naturally describe the monsters as dangerous, so that they would be understood as hazards to navigation. They would discourage navigation in the Indian Ocean. This, on the other hand, is Waldseemüller's Carta Marina of 1516, produced just 9 years later. On this map, Waldseemüller has abandoned the medieval text about sea monsters from his 1507 map, but illustrates one sea monster off the southern tip of Africa. This is an image of King Manuel of Portugal riding a sea monster, and in artistic terms, it is the first truly Renaissance image of a sea monster on a map. The monster is drawn in 3 dimensions and is shown as being in motion, in contrast to most medieval sea monsters. But this is also a Renaissance image in another sense. While the sea monsters on Waldseemüller's 1507 map are dangerous and would thus discourage navigation, the image on the Carta Marina shows a human being controlling a sea monster, and thus boldly proclaims human mastery over the dangers of the sea, and by extension, dominion over the oceans themselves. The ocean is no longer thus so much a place of danger as an element that can be conquered by humans, and across which trade can be conducted. These two maps and their sea monsters, made just 9 years apart, reflect a transition from a medieval to a Renaissance conception of the ocean. This is Olaus Magnus's Carta Marina of 1539. This happens to be a 1572 printing of the map. Olaus Magnus was a Swedish historian and geographer who lived from about 1490 to 1557. And this map of Scandinavia and the Norwegian Sea and the North Sea was published in 1539, and in 1555 he published a book called The History of the Northern Peoples that supplies more detail about some of the creatures depicted on his map. Zooming in a bit, we can see that the Norwegian Sea is densely populated with a great variety of sea creatures and sea monsters. The images of the monsters on this map are quite original, and they were by far the most influential images, such images of the 16th century. We'll see evidence of their influence shortly. Zooming in to see a few examples, and I quote here the descriptive text from his book. For this whale, he says, "The spouter or leviathan is 300 feet long. In order to destroy sailors, it often rises high above the yardarms of vessels and spurts forth the waves it has sucked into the tubes above its head." Another very similar creature, and he explains that sometimes it is not satisfied with doing mischief to a ship merely by showering water on it. It throws itself onto a ship's prow or stern and presses on it till the vessel sinks down and becomes submerged, or fiercely overturns it with its back or tail as if the craft were some small dish. Describing two more very similar sea monsters, he says that voyagers to India confirm the enormous size of these brutes and say that the sound of shouting and trumpets repels and disperses them. So this is another case where we have some advice about how to try to repel sea monsters in case you're attacked by them. And that's evidently a trumpet there on the stern of the ship rather than a gun. And here we have an image of the Xiphias, which is eating a seal while it itself is being gnawed on by another sea monster. And Olaus Magnus says that the Xiphias has a ghastly head like that of an owl, a back that is tapering, or rather raised into the form of a sword, and a sharply pointed beak. And here we have a classic image of sea monster on a map, which I showed earlier. And Olaus Magnus says it's a serpent of gigantic bulk, at least 200 feet long and 20 feet thick, that frequents the cliffs and hollows of the seacoast near Bergen. It assaults ships, rearing itself on high like a pillar, seizes men, and devours them. A colleague of mine, Luigi Deana, has given an interesting explanation of the many sea monsters in the Norwegian Sea on Olaus Magnus's map. He suggests that they were intended to scare away the fishermen of other nations, leaving the abundant catch to Scandinavian fishermen. If this suggestion is correct, it represents a unique use of sea monsters for economic motives. This is Gerard Mercator's terrestrial globe of 1541, one of the most important of the 16th century. And this is a sea monster from that globe. It may look familiar because Mercator took the sea monsters on that globe from Olaus Magnus's map, which had been published just 2 years earlier. So if we set them side by side, again, the major difference is that they're reversed left to right, but there can really be no doubt about the source. And looking at another sea monster from the globe, again, Mercator has removed the ship from the image, but in all other respects it's very similar. And so this globe not only provides evidence for the influence of Olaus Magnus's map, but also shows Mercator's interest in using the most recent sources available to him for the sea creatures on his maps and globes. This is a manuscript map from 1546. It's anonymous. It was made in France by a member of the so-called Dieppe School of Cartography. It contains a large and diverse collection of sea monsters, including the first realistic whaling scene on any map, the first sawfish on a map, but also a sea dragon that seems based on medieval imagery. So it's quite a various collection. This is a detail of the North Atlantic between Newfoundland and Labrador, and we see 5 men in a small boat harpooning a whale. We are no doubt to understand that they came from the ship nearby. Zoom in a little bit. To judge from their clothes, they are probably Basque, and the Basque tradition of whaling goes back to the 11th century. The whale has 2 harpoons sticking from its back, and quite curiously seems to have wings, and also what looks like a large mustache. The mustache is no doubt the cartographer's attempt to portray baleen, which the Basques commonly referred to as barbas de ballena, or beards of the whale. Although the whaling scene has some fantastic elements, some fanciful elements, even the mustache represents an interest in making the depiction of the whale accurate, and the whaling scene is much more realistic than the scene on Methia de Veladista's map of 1413 that we saw earlier. Here we see the sawfish off the eastern coast of South America. Zoom in a bit. Given its location, it seems likely that the cartographer's source was either the description in the 1535 edition of González Fernández de Oviedo's General History of the New World, in which the creature is presented as a great novelty, or else an illustrated manuscript of Oviedo's book, for there is one surviving manuscript that of that work that does have an illustration of a sawfish, which we see here. On the same map from 1546, west of Java Minor, there is a beautiful sea dragon, zoom in a little bit here, which is quite similar to some of the medieval images of the sea monster that swallowed Jonah. Given the variety of sea monsters on this map, it seems likely that the anonymous cartographer had a strong interest in this subject and had collected examples from his map from several sources. Here we have an image of part of Gerard Mercator's famous world map of 1569, whose title translates as New and Improved Description of the World for the Use of Navigators. The large map is best known for being the first to make practical use of a projection that came to bear Mercator's name, The projection is advantageous because on a map made with it, a course on a constant compass bearing is represented by a straight line. The sea monsters on the map, which have never been studied, reveal one of the sources that Mercator was using. They come from a book about sea creatures by Pierre Bellon that was published 16 years before the map. Here we see a whale in the Pacific, rather ominously surrounded by ships. And if we set it beside the image from Bellon's book, there really can't be much doubt about the fact that Mercator was making use of that book. Here we have a sea serpent in the South Atlantic. And again, setting the two side by side, there can really be not much doubt of Mercator's source. And one more, and we have Neptune riding a seahorse in the South Pacific. And here, Mercator has added Neptune, but it's clearer where he got the image of the seahorse. On his 1541 globe that we looked at earlier, Mercator borrowed his whales from Olaus Magnus's map, which had been published just 2 years earlier. And on his 1569 map, he copied a sea monster from Pierre Bellon's book, which was published 16 years earlier. In both cases, Mercator made use of some of the most recent works available to him about sea creatures. In the middle of the 16th century, there arose a fashion for whimsical sea monsters on maps. This fashion represents a shift in the role of cartographic sea monsters from being indications of the dangers of the ocean and also displays of knowledge by the cartographer, which also served a decorative purpose, to being more purely decorative. Many of these monsters are the result of combining parts of different creatures, which was a common technique used in the invention of monsters, while others seem to be the products of the cartographer's whimsy. So here we see a defiant sea creature with a human face and even a mustache. Here, a haunting image of a sea creature that seems to be suffering. Sometimes it's hard to come up with names for them, so I call it a marine pig dog. And sort of an old man of the sea, but at a tremendous size and with quite intimidating fingernails. Early image of windsurfing from a map here at the Library of Congress. And this creature, which I showed at the beginning, it's an extravagant composite based on a whale because it's spouting, but it spouts through no less than 5 elephants' trunks and has the head of a bird. So if the ocean was gradually becoming less dangerous to sailors in the late 16th century, it was still a realm where exotic creations of the imagination could be projected. In 1592, Johannes van Doetinchem designed a map of Canada and the North Atlantic, which he titled Nova Francia. From the point of view of sea monsters, the map is of interest for a striking contrast it reveals. In the Atlantic, it has some fantastic depictions of whales that derive, probably indirectly, from Olaus Magnus, while near the lower edge of the map, there is an inset scene that shows naked and half-naked men, possibly Basque to judge from their helmets and boats, throwing spears or harpoons into one whale, while others flense a whale further up the beach. In fact, the realistic whaling inset is copied from a plate published in 1582. The two whales in this inset look entirely different from and are much more lifelike than the whale-like creatures in the Atlantic. Thus, this map uses two different iconographical traditions of whales, one older and essentially mythical, the other more recent and realistic. Here you can see them both together, the fantastic whales in the Atlantic and the more realistic ones in the inset. In 1621, Honorius Philoponus published an account of the Benedictine missionaries who accompanied Columbus on his second voyage to the Americas. The book is part history and part fantasy and contains curious illustrations, including this map of the North Atlantic. We see here again a representation of St. Brendan mistaking a whale for an island, and in this case, his men are celebrating Mass on the whale's back. The whale is clearly inspired by those of Olaus Magnus's map, and thus, in the 17th century, not only Olaus Magnus's sea monsters, but also the myth of St. Brendan still had a hold on people's imagination. Yet the age of sea monsters on maps was beginning to come to an end. Just 4 years later, a very different and much more pragmatic and realistic map with images of whales was published. Here we have Thomas Edge's map of Greenland, by which name he actually means Spitsbergen. This confusion of names was common in the 17th century. The map was made in 1625 and has vignettes of the Arctic whale fishery around its edges. Although the images are in a very simplistic artistic style, they are remarkable as they illustrate all of the methods involved in catching and processing a whale. And so this map shows the captain of a whaling ship both where to go and the fundamental steps of how to do his job. So we see here harpooning the whale, towing the dead whale to a ship, flensing the whale, removing the blubber, landing the blubber and cutting it up, boiling, filtering, and barreling the blubber, cleaning and scraping the whale fins, as they're called above, i.e. the baleen. And the baleen of whales was used in corsets, hoop skirts, and buggy whips at the time. We have seen depictions of whaling in earlier maps, but I would suggest that in this map, Thomas Edge shows the whale in a different light. Here, the mighty Leviathan is perceived as an object of economic exploitation and has lost much of its monstrosity. The different images of whales on de Wettecom's map of 1592, some fantastic and others realistic, together with the contrasting images of whales on Philoponus' 1621 map and Thomas Edge's map, clearly show that the late 16th and early 17th century was a time of transition for sea monsters on maps. As the 17th century progressed and as navigational technology improved, sea monsters became less and less common on maps, and this chapter of the history of the illustration of sea creatures gradually closed. But rather than end on that sad note, I'll finish with images of three of my favorite sea monsters, three of the aquatic marvels that appeared on maps during the centuries that cartographic sea monsters held sway. This first is a potent image of the danger of the sea from the ceiling at Zillis, Switzerland. This composite monster has the head of a dog, the torso of a man, and the tail of a fish, and demonstrates total control over his poor human victim. The second is another composite sea creature, this one of pure whimsy, in a book of maps from 1572. We see the head of an elephant, the body of a bird, and impressive spikes jutting from its back. So, again, pure fantasy. And the third shows a huge sea monster preparing to bite the stern of a galley in the Mediterranean, while sailors try to fend it off with spears. To this otherwise dire scene, a note of humor is added by the creature's enormous and elegantly curved eyelashes. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for a few questions.
Sure. Yes.
Is there any relationship on the maps between hazardous sea conditions and locations of monsters?
Not that I've seen. Not that I've seen, yeah. One might think so, but I haven't seen any evidence of that. Yes.
You mentioned that one of your map makers was Turkish. Are there any other non-Western traditions of cartography that involve sea monsters?
There are. I've seen a number of Japanese maps that have sea monsters, for example, but for this study, I confined my attention to European maps. So there are some Islamic maps, a few that have sea monsters, some Japanese maps. So that's perhaps an area for a future study.
Do these monsters spill over into other things besides maps? I'm thinking they're illustrated editions of Dante that have devils that look very similar.
My focus was finding the sources of the creatures on the maps and not so much finding where those creatures on the maps ended up. And it's a complicated question because there aren't many cases where we could be certain that the creature came from a map and not from a book that was the source of the image on the map. But
I like how you were able to trace where these monsters came from contemporary natural histories and such. But did you find any examples of the cartographers getting stories from sailors or from people who spent time in the East Indies or this sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. For the early maps, in many cases, I was not able to determine the sources because so much material from that period just no longer exists. And so when I wasn't able to find the source for a monster in an earlier book or manuscript, it could have come from a story from a sea captain. That's possible, but in general, I would say that the people making the maps didn't have much contact. They were probably in a monastery, and thus were probably not frequently having conversations with sea captains. Yes,
I'm curious about the map that was produced by the Gep School.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I just wasn't listening, but did you give a date for that?
Yes, 1546.
1546, and where is that?
It's in the UK. I'm forgetting the name of the library. Manchester.
John?
Chet, any difference between New World and Old World sea monsters?
Yes, in the book I go into that towards the end of the book. I talk about that a little bit. There are some sea monsters on maps that come from André Tevet's book about the New World, and they're very distinctive. And part of that is Tevet curiously rejected traditional Western literary accounts of monsters, but came up with his own. So he's very scornful of other accounts of monsters, and yet invented his own. And some of his do appear, yes, near the New World.
Let's take one more question.
I noticed that the image that you had of you said the woman windsurfing, it comes from a map here at the library, immediately reminded me of Botticelli's Birth of Venus.
Yes.
So I wondered, are there sort of elements of these maps that may come from paintings instead of nautical charts or?
Yes. I don't know of a case of that nature. In the case of that image, that the woman is actually an illustration of bold fortune, and there are books of emblems that have very similar images with the woman holding this sort of scarf above her head. So in that case, I suspect it was one of those emblem books that provided the image rather than a painting, but it's hard to be sure.
Okay, thank you again, Chet, for a wonderful
Thank you.
Chet's book is available for purchase at the entrance, and I'm sure he'll he'll autograph it for you. And I'd also like to remind you, those who are interested in keeping up with the Kluge programs, to register over on this table. Travis will help you if there are any questions that you have. Thank you again for attending. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.